Orca, orca, vace, vace. Orca, 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 orca.
Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. My name is Guy and we're talking orcs. Now, there's much more to orcs than just meets the eye, and I believe that you can make your orcs even that much more interesting with just a little thought. That's what we're looking at today. Now, this video, I do have to say, is brought to you by our Patreons. I do thank each and every one of our Patreons for supporting the channel, for allowing us to advance and adapt and grow and basically just have a blast whilst making these videos. So thank you to each and every one of you. Now, when it comes to unpacking the orc, there are three things that we're going to look at. We're going to look at what do we expect from orcs. What do we expect from orcs? Blood, mayhem, death, murder, green. Well, that's something that we're going to look at. What are the alternatives? Now, the alternatives is where you get to shine in terms of making orcs more like, well, more your own rather than just cookie cutter mold kind of generic thingies. We don't want that. We're great game masters, not mundane game masters. So that's what we're going to be looking at, alternatives, and then we're going to look at how do you actually demonstrate this? How do you actually make this work for your game? So those are the things we're going to be looking at today. Stay with us as we now dive into what do we expect. Expectation, of course, is the ultimate power. It really is the ultimate power in terms of determining, well, just pretty much everything about our game. So what do we expect from orcs? We expect greenskins. Oh yeah, we the boys from the orc spaces where we're going to fight and we've got big tusks sticking out our jaws and work. Now, greenskins, where does that come from? Well, orcs have traditionally been greenskin monsters since the advent of things like Warhammer and World of Warcraft, or even Warcraft, the original game which came out so very long ago. It kind of entrenched in us that greenskins, the orc, is the fundamental basis when we think of orcs. Now, of course, Tolkien's orcs are quite different from that. They're the sort of strange skin-coloured creatures. The origin stories of the two are very different. The orcs in Warhammer, and I'm not entirely sure if they translated that into Warcraft, but there's a fungal aspect to the orcs from Warhammer. The orcs from Lord of the Rings are, of course, corrupted elves and things like that. So there's different origin stories, but generally speaking, they've unilaterally, by the way, got this very low-class British sort of sounding voice, and whether it's grotbag or scumbag or whatever, they all have that same kind of approach to orcishness, if you like. They're all brutal. Orcs are traditionally incredibly brutal. They are violent, loving, giant monsters that just like to maim and pillage and destroy, and possibly some raping if we go to a movie first. So there is a desperately pervasive atmosphere that orcs are brutal. Now, they tried to unpack that a little bit, especially in the latest Warcraft movie, where they wanted to show the little tender side of the orc nature, which I believe should firmly be there. I just feel that the movie didn't necessarily do it justice. They kind of explored it, but they didn't go very far. We also expect orcs to be tribal. The little chieftains, the little clans, the little fiefdoms that they control, all those kinds of things. We expect them to be tribal. We don't expect these giant orc empires that grow and expand in different directions. And certainly if there are empires like that, that utilize orcs, we certainly don't expect them to be controlled by orcs. There's a certain limited factor that you could apply to orcs, I suppose. So those are the expectations, and if you've used orcs like this in your game, you're not alone. I myself have used this exact template multiple times for orcs. And that's one of the reasons why when someone said, "Oh, please make a video on orcs," I went, yes, it is time we revisited our brutal, tribalistic greenskins. And that's exactly what we're going to look at. So when we do that, we talk about alternatives. Have you ever considered making your orcs Vikings? What about the Maori? And how about Aztecs? Why do I choose these three alternatives for orc representation? Is it because I believe that these are particularly barbaric, backward cultures that best represent the greenskins? No. It's because I believe that these are three very interesting cultures that come from three very different parts of the world, but that have similarities to one another in terms of certain qualities, and that being a warrior-based culture. Now, orcs are fundamentally warriors, and in our games, generally speaking, they are the antagonists. They're going to be fighting against our heroes. So we do need them to have a certain amount of antagonism. Interestingly enough, the Maori had a different, there was a subset of the Maori, the Moriori, which I hope I pronounced that correctly. New Zealanders, please punish me accordingly. But nonetheless, they were a pacifistic group, and as soon as the Maori found them, they slaughtered them to the man and basically wiped them out. So pacifist orcs don't necessarily work when you have more violent species roaming around. It is a dog-eat-dog, or in this case, orc-eat-orc kind of world. And that's another similarity that these three these three cultures have in common. The Aztecs and the Maoris both practiced cannibalism from time to time, according to certain archaeological reports, and the Vikings, we know, were particularly bloodthirsty and quite violent, and of course seafaring folk and explorers and the like. Now, when we unpack this, if you were to make orcs as Vikings, that gives them the nautical culture that we all associate with Vikings, the seafaring, raiding kind. That buys into the general idea of orcs. But Vikings take it a step further. They're an incredibly religious people. There's lots of beliefs in the different gods, Odin, Thor, Loki, and the like, as well as a reverence for honor and a certain amount of familial protection. You protect your family. You do the right thing. You garner honor through combat, through achievement and the like, and you advance. Now, Vikings also used to have fairly small self-contained hamlets that would operate under a jarl, and of course that was then looked after over by the king, I suppose you could say, who would then control these different sects, very much in a tribal kind of state. The Maori used to build things called pa. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I could be completely wrong. I hope not. Nonetheless, the pa were effectively hill forts that looked very similar to the European motte and bailey, except they were a lot more, to my mind anyway, they were a lot more castle-like than just a motte and then a bailey. They were built on hills and they would command a certain amount of territory. So the Maori also had a tribal approach to things, but they had that wonderful dance, the haka, which technically I suppose is called the kapa haka, which means the team challenge, that wonderful dance that they do. If you haven't watched it, please go and have a look at it on the YouTube. It's very good. The YouTube, go and look at it on the YouTube. Go and look at it on YouTube. You'll find it there. It's very easy. It's very inspirational in terms of creating a much better and a much more interesting thing. Now imagine if you had this line of orcs, all with heavy weaponry, dragon scale armor and tusks of a mammoth and things adorning their bodies, performing these amazing ritual dances, a challenge to their opponents. I think that could make them very, very interesting. Just as with the Vikings, if you had all of these orcs arriving in these longboats, they've got these big round shields and not necessarily horns on helmets, but you get the idea. It could also be quite visually stunning. If we go to the Aztecs were basically a hegemony type of empire. The central Aztec kingdom controlled or dominated the area around it, but it didn't really control each little city. That kind of left the cities to run on their own as long as they provided tribute back to the central command, the central empire, if you like. They were kind of left to their own. What makes the Aztecs quite interesting, I think anyway, is that they also had a tribal culture. They were incredibly gender specific, but also kind of gender equal. Women could inherit land and so on, as well as control land. They could become doctors, priests, merchants, all kinds of interesting things, as could the men. However, it was decided or determined that the women would stay in home and look after home and hearth, whereas the men would go off to war and look after the fields. So there was quite a gender equality, but still very sort of aligned to specific things. Now, they considered looking after the home as equitable as going to battle, which, if you've ever had a household full of kids, I think you can agree it's probably the same thing. Now, the Aztecs have a very interesting ritual sacrifice of prisoners and things. There's one rumor that there was one sacrifice where they sacrificed 80,000 slaves in the period of 4 days. A lot of historians believe that's an inflated number, but even if you take a tenth of that, that's still a significant number of people being sacrificed. It brings a very different aspect to your orcs. Your orcs now are very, very, very religious. They are looking to appease the gods with sacrifices. Their motivations are different. However, all three of these have in common the fact that they were all just looking after their family, they were all trying to survive, they were all trying to appease their gods and basically avoid calamity. To my thinking, this is what makes for a much more interesting space of exploration than just the standard orc. Now, I have only just touched on some of the highlights of these different cultures. You can dive into them and explore them more, understand more how these different cultures work, and then apply them to those orcs. Now, how do we then apply them to the orcs? This video, I'm not going to go and unpack each and every single one of these. You can go and watch as many YouTube videos as you like. I do, however, quite like the idea of Maori orcs, simply because of the face paint and there's that wonderful dance that they have, and it's a much richer culture. Green obsidian, or at least green stone used in their weaponry, which I think links to the orcs. Now, an important thing here is that we're not erasing the orc. We're not saying that the orc doesn't have big tusks, doesn't have green skin or purple skin, whatever you colour you want to go with. We're not saying that that is not valid. What we're saying is we're now taking aspects or elements of these cultures and we're now adding them to the orc rather than just having the generic sort of low-class British thug that a lot of us default to. These are just helping enhance your game, which is the ultimate point of the videos. So how do we demonstrate these things? Now we've got these amazing cultures, we've gone and researched them, we've gone and explored them, and we've worked out how they apply to our orcs. How do we now demonstrate these in our game? I beg your pardon. In our game. So how do we do that? Well, I always say 3 traits. We look at 3 traits, whether it's social or cultural, whether it's greetings, whether it's combat, however we want to do that. So 3 traits with the Vikings, it might be that every time an orc meets an opponent, they throw their axe into the ground in front of the opponent to see whether the opponent will lift the axe as a sign of aggression or throw their own axe down into the sand as a sign of peace, for example. That could be one trait. Another trait might be that whenever they see an enemy, they have to perform a ritual dance, such as the haka. That's the second trait. A third trait might be once they have slain the victim, they have to pull, or at least once they've slain their enemy, I should say, they have to pull the heart of the enemy out and consume a piece of it so that they gain the strength of their enemy, but also that they worship and show respect to their enemy, that they had to kill their enemy. However you want to do that. So 3 traits, I would say, is a good starter. You can add to it as you go along. You don't have to create an entire race, an entire culture off the bat. You can let it evolve and grow over time. So how do you express that? Well, as I have said with the 3 traits, when your orcs are encountered, they need to go through these same rituals. And the reason why, and you go, well, surely once I've done it once, that's okay. Well, not necessarily. Every time you meet someone new in a Western culture, you stick your hand out and you give them a handshake. The new trend, of course, is that you go in for a hug. You should always ask beforehand, however, whether people are huggers or not, as a lot of people aren't, so be aware of that. Handshake is the traditional one. Here in Japan, of course, one bows courteously, and how far you bow down indicates how much respect you're showing to the person that you are bowing to. So there are many different ways and means of greetings and showing these and expressing these to the players, and you need to repeat it. The reason why you repeat it is because it entrenches it as unique to that culture. It also helps you remember what that particular culture's greeting is, that you don't suddenly have elves greeting in the way of orcs and causing your players to panic because they think that the orcs are now disguised as elves. It'll happen, trust me. So when do you then express this kind of stuff? Well, you express this kind of stuff whenever you can and whenever it's not going to affect the pace. So if the orcs have to perform their haka, their song, every time they go into battle, have the PCs look over and see the orcs assembling, see them going through their dance, do a few gestures, however you want to do it, and then move forward. You don't have to do the entire 2-minute piece every single time. That simply slows down the pacing. Every time they meet an orc, have the axe challenge occur. Describe it the first time round, maybe the second or the third time round, but I generally like to associate an action with it, however it might be when they are first meeting the particular race and subsequently thereafter. What that allows is it's basically a shorthand. Every time players see the orcs, and the orcs traditionally throw an axe in the sand, you can say the orc walks up to you and greets you in the traditional fashion by gesticulating that you're throwing the axe down. If the players are good players, they will gesticulate, I throw my sword down. Until eventually, when they're doing that, that just means that that is how they're greeting the orcs. They're starting to incorporate that culture into their own subconscious, into their own memories of the orcs from your world. So that is how I go about trying to make orcs that much more interesting. And I really, really like the idea of the Viking style orc, the Maori style orc, or even the Aztec style orc. And you can look at different cultures and don't think for a second that those particular cultures are from ancient history. The Aztecs were only up until the 1500s. The Maoris only started at the 1200s, moving up until present day, as a matter of fact. The Vikings were in 900 AD. So there are very different kind of time sets to look at. You could look at the Zulu culture, I suppose, from southern Africa, where there was a warrior culture after King Shaka Zulu took power and started to militarize the Zulu army. So you could look at different cultures and say, okay, well, I like the aspects of that culture, or I like the aspects of that culture. Let's explore, let's unpack, let's see how we can apply that to our orc. So there we go. That's the orcs for you. And well, I hope that this video has been informative. If it has, you know what to do. And until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of gaming.
Like. Subscribe. Yes. And finally, share.